This is the Latin News podcast, our first episode in what will be a fortnightly update on events, news, and important issues taking place in the region. I am Richard McCall, your host. I'm a longtime foreign correspondent here in Latin America and an analyst. My very special guest, well, he'll need no introduction to many of you out there, is Jon Farmer, who is the editor-in-chief of the Latin News as well, LatinNews.com. And we're going to be discussing this week Peru and what has been going on in Peru politically, economically, and so on in the last few months, because this is a really serious issue that's been going on. But first and foremost, let me just say, well, welcome on this inaugural podcast, Jon.
Hi, Richard. Well, thanks for the big fanfare. I mean, that's always welcome.
Well,
very excited to be here at the start of this new venture for us at Latin News, and we've got some fascinating podcasts lined up.
Yeah, we do. So we're going to be going from Peru, and then we're going to move on to Chile. We've got Brazil, I believe, in the pipeline, and also Paraguay, because there's elections coming up. Yeah, we've got them all set up. So actually very exciting to be here, very exciting to be leading this charge to bring Latin News out onto the podcast, let's say, arena. But yes, let's not create any more fanfare, and let's get into the sort of nitty-gritty of what's been going on in Peru. We know, well, I mean, there's been daily protests since December. It's been incredibly unsettled, of course. We're looking at, I mean, if we take a full summary of what's going on, 6 years, 6 presidents, 3 congresses, 15 prime ministers, a reshuffling of more than 250 ministers. Right now, we've got Dina Boluarte as president. What is going on, Jon?
Do you want the short answer or the long answer? I guess we've only got half an hour. So,
go on.
I don't think we can do justice to what's happening now without going back in time a bit. So some people would say you need to go way back to the colonial era, and that this created this indigenous provincial underclass governed by a white elite from Lima, and that's really at the root of these wrenching socio-economic divisions of today, and that it's that old cleavage which is still very much there. But I mean, I think for the purpose of this podcast, I think if we start off in the present, and then what's happening right now, and then we can work back, I think, to the Fujimori era could be enlightening, and shed some lights on how we got here and what might happen in the future.
Okay, so I mean, we were looking at what happened as in Pedro Castillo was ousted. Obviously, he was trying to run, I guess, from an authoritarian perspective, I would suggest. He was ousted. Dina Boluarte is in. We wouldn't have been mistaken to have thought that she may have gone fast as well, given the unsettled nature of Peru, but she's still in power. What are the people calling for? I mean, what I hear is there's calls for a new president. There's calls for a new constitution. There's an erosion of trust, but I think it goes back a long time, by the rural poor in like the political class. We're looking at this population of 33 million, of which millions live in poverty. And then the flashpoints at the moment, still continuing today, seem to be in the south of the country, in Puno and Juliaca. Just because they're not in the press doesn't mean they've stopped. They're just not in the press. But I think, rather than look at Dina Boluarte, who's in power now, tell me a bit about former President Pedro Castillo. How did he, first and foremost, the election was him against Fujimori's daughter, Keiko Fujimori, and it was a marginal win at best to get Pedro Castillo in. So, I mean, how did we get to that point?
Yeah, so, I mean, Pedro Castillo, massive outsider. He really sprang from out of nowhere to win election in 2021. Benefited really from the fact that there's a colossal sense of disillusionment with the political class in Peru, but also like the total atomization of the political system, so the party political system. So, there were 18 candidates running in that first round, and you didn't really need to get too many votes in order to get a place in that second round berth, if you like, in that runoff. So that the threshold was so low to get there because it was just the vote was so split, so divided. So there wasn't a single poll at the time that suggested that he would be in the runoff. So that all came as a sort of complete surprise. Having got there, of course, then there's a different ballgame because there was this huge anti-Keiko, anti-Fujimori sentiment in Peru, and also I think a lot of particularly indigenous rural Peruvians who felt disenfranchised for years sort of saw Castillo, this rural school teacher, as one of them. And certainly if you look at the second round voting in southern regions in particular, he got way over 80% of the vote. In fact, in Puno, which is the epicenter has been the epicenter of the protests, he got 89% in the second round against Fujimori.
So, I mean, were we seeing also a higher turnout in voting, especially in those regions then, in sort of Puno, Juliaca, and the areas, I guess, bordering Bolivia to the south?
I think there was some feeling amongst people, particularly in those regions, that here was an opportunity for change. There'd been so much disillusionment for so long with the established political class, and I think a lot of people sort of bought into his sort of populist left-wing promises.
So when we talk about populist left-wing, we could digress massively across the region, but let's not. But do we think that there was, support coming from external influences? I mean, for his election, I think we need to get that out there.
Absolutely, that's what the Fujimoristas claimed. I mean, I'm not personally don't think there was an enormous amount of that.
So, I mean, we get to Pedro Castillo, and of course, it's, as I mentioned in the sort of opening summary, so many presidents in such a short amount of time. Before him, we had Martín Vizcarra, who, as well as from a southern region, and I guess he ran on an anti-corruption ticket. He had political affiliations, but he was then sort of, let's say, ousted after 2 votes of no confidence, because that's in the Peruvian constitution. After 2 of those, you kind of have to step aside. This was November 2020, but he seemed to have sort of, I would say, steadied the ship a bit. He seemed to, and yet then the opposition found, are they alleged cases of corruption in some sort of mining deals to the south? What happened with Martín Vizcarra?
Yeah, there were allegations of that sort, but really Congress was just gunning for him, and Vizcarra was ultimately exposed in the same way that President Kuczynski had been, by the fact that he just lacked a sort of serious presence in Congress. And again, that's the problem that Castillo has faced, and really the last 6 years in Peru that have just been so volatile, with Peru's just lurching from sort of one political crisis to another, and so much of it is down to the fact that the presidents who've been in power have not really had much in the way of a congressional presence, and they've also faced a very hostile Congress. Certainly under when Kuczynski was in power at the beginning, Congress completely controlled by Fujimorismo, enraged that Keiko wasn't elected, and really practiced some seriously obstructionist tactics. But what this really makes me think of, actually, and I think this is really pertinent, is Article 113 of the Peruvian Constitution, which people might not be familiar with, and I'm not sure I was particularly until suddenly it was just being used left, right, and center. So this is the article which allows for the removal of a sitting president for permanent moral incapacity. But, let's put this into perspective, because between 1839, when this was first introduced to the Constitution, and 2000, this procedure was used just 3 times. And then Castillo's was the 7th impeachment attempt in the last 5 years for permanent moral incapacity. 3 of those were obviously successful. They removed President Kaczynski in 2018, Martín Vizcarra in November 2020, and obviously now Castillo. So this is no longer a rare and extreme event. It's becoming sort of commonplace. But all these heads of state that I just mentioned were all vulnerable in that they lacked this strong backing in Congress. And this article has really been seized upon by parties in Congress that just sort of weaponized it, and it's just a sort of political device now. And it should really have been the Constitutional Tribunal had a chance to address this article, and it really just fluffed its lines, because it refused to define the instances in which Congress could actually invoke it. So it remains so ambiguous and imprecise. And as long as you can muster a 2/3 majority in Congress, you can basically impeach a president for whatever. It's just about having the votes.
It's very nebulous, isn't it? Moral incapacity.
Absolutely.
It makes me think of just about any leader anywhere in the world could then be. This is one of these items in a constitution that maybe should have been left behind in the early 19th century. It's just there for posterity and to make us laugh a little bit. It does sound like that, but now, as you say, weaponized entirely. And I mean, if we are to back it somewhat, okay, it's one of those things that can enable the political parties to. This is always what they seem to be aiming for, especially in the region. It's a device to combat corruption or presumed corruption, and of course, Peru, we know that the corruption is rampant. And has this been really the driving force behind the unrest and the unsettled nature of Peru in recent years?
I think it's got a huge part to play in it. Obviously, we had the Odebrecht corruption scandal prior to this. There was corruption allegations hurled at Castillo by Congress. I think, this is probably a good opportunity actually just to go back to Alberto Fujimori, as we kind of intimated at the beginning, because he was a populist anti-system outsider himself, came to power 1990, faced a hostile Congress which was sort of obstructed his agenda, but he's very popular. And in 1992, he carried out this autogolpe, dissolving Congress, concentrating power in his own hands. I mean, the difference to when Castillo attempted it, of course, is that Fujimori just parked a tank on the steps of Congress, whereas in Castillo's case, he just did. The armed forces were never behind him, and they issued a statement very promptly, a joint statement with the police, disavowing sort of any part in it. But really, so we have Fujimori in power, 1992, autogolpe. For the next 8 years, he really just set about dismantling Peru's democracies, hollowed out institutions. I mean, corruption just permeated everything, rampant cronyism, siphoning off of public funds, media and judiciary totally co-opted. But I think, one of the really baleful legacies of the Fujimori era is really the sort of collapsed party system, which just became totally sort of atomized. Parties prior to him used to represent something. They had recognized ideologies, but then after this, after he departed and democracy was restored in 2000, the party system didn't just sort of spring back to life, and parties have no real links to society. People just don't feel unrepresented, and this is damaging democratic legitimacy. But it's also, it just feeds corruption, because these guys who are getting elected on and supported by very shadowy sort of interest groups to Congress, and it's I think we can't underestimate the impact of the sort of Fujimori era, in the sense that it's just the public faith in institutions, in the party system, and in politicians who are just fundamentally seen as being corrupt, was just shattered, and that's just not been rebuilt. And if you look at, I mean, it's actually really interesting if you look at the sort of the presidents who were elected, say Alejandro Toledo, he's elected in 2001. His party, Peru Posible, had, if I remember, 45 seats in Congress. You know, then his popularity sinks like a lump of lead, and he's got single-digit popularity towards the end. And this is not uncommon in Peru, for presidents just plummet in popularity. But when, you know, in 2006, Peru Posible is completely wiped out, wins 2 seats in Congress. And this is the same story with Ollanta, comes in 2011. His party, Gana Peru, has similar sort of amount, 47 seats, I think. 2016, totally wiped out. So these parties, they don't have sort of long-term visions. They're just personalist vehicles for the candidates who are, you know, running for president.
So we think that this party system really, I mean, they change names and they chop and they're altered and so on. It's for personal financial gain. These politicians, for, would you say it's
well, very much. And I think I heard a really interesting comment recently from Alberto Fujimori, who's like a Peru's well-known academic and political scientist, and he sort of said, you know, Peru's often called a democracy without parties, and he said, look, actually, it's now a democracy without Democrats. You know, members of Congress are sacrificing democracy for their own interests. There's no rules of the game anymore. It's like a football match, you know, when all the players take to the pitch and to start using their hats.
I mean, this is a tough one. We're going back. I want to go back to Fujimori as well. I was there for the elections when Toledo got in and so on. Of course, he painted himself as more allied to the indigenous movement by being indigenous, you know, descent himself. But if we look at Fujimori, he comes in and you say he parks his tank on the steps of Congress. It's a different time, of course, as well. I'm not supporting what he did. Of course, he had the backing of the armed forces. You know, they were still combating what was the political shining path, Sendero Luminoso, and the Tupac Amaru. So there's a belief in the armed forces. Why this time were the armed forces not backing Castillo? It's because we've moved on from this era of, let's say, Admiral Guzman and everything else? It's a different Peru altogether. Economically, it's been a success, tourism-wise, and also for extractive industries. Why did the armed forces say, well, this time we are not involved?
I think all the points you make are relevant, and all stack up for sure. But I just think that equally the security forces, you know, they're looking at there was no real consultation from Castillo. I mean, this was just a complete bolt from the blue. He didn't have anything like the same level of popularity that Fujimori had. Fujimori was a far cannier politician, and he would never have attempted that without knowing full well that he had the backing of the armed forces beforehand. So, you know, this is what makes the whole thing sort of difficult to understand. I mean, what possessed Castillo to think that he could sort of pull this off? I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? It's hard to know exactly what he was thinking, because even his closest advisors have said they had no idea what he was planning, and if they had, they would have tried to sort of talk him out of it. We know that, you know, he'd been in this relentless standoff with a right-leaning Congress from the moment he took office, really, and appointed this far-left cabinet, and then he's just harried relentlessly by Congress. And there's this kind of constant brinkmanship with Congress had just been going on throughout, pretty much his entire time in power. But equally, Congress was advancing on several fronts with efforts to remove him. There's no question it had these constitutional complaints, which would have seen him suspended from office. But they weren't really necessarily going anywhere. I mean, the first one of them was actually just thrown out by the Constitutional Tribunal anyway, which was some flimsy accusation of treason because he'd made some remarks to CNN about granting Bolivia sovereign access to the sea. But he made no further attempt. It was just a comment he made. And the other one was much more substantial, the one that was presented by the Attorney General. So that's the one that accused Castillo of leading a criminal organization, influence peddling, and collusion. But again, this rested on very dubious constitutional grounds, because in the constitution in Peru, corruption's not one of the 4 offenses for which president can stand trial.
Huh.
So I think, if I could have been in his head to see what had motivated him, I'd love to know, because it seemed, but what happened before, he basically sealed his own fate, because Congress had tried to impeach him twice before and it had failed to gather the 2/3 majority. There was absolutely nothing to suggest it was going to succeed to get it this time around. But the second he announced the dissolution of Congress, it was like he's just signed his own death warrant, and he's impeached by this absolutely thumping majority. And
we put this down to, I would put this down to total political naivety, right? Lack of experience. Yes. I mean, it seems like as you said, if his closest advisors and friends did not know that this was going to happen, it sounds like he woke up and a knee-jerk reaction was, this is what I'm doing, and I will be supported by the people who voted for me. But
yes,
something else happened. But then, of course, things, we're bringing it back up to the current day. Things kicked off. We got the images, the very visual reality of what was happening in Peru. At the time that we're talking, there are 50 plus people who have been killed. Of course, a large number of these by state forces. There has been investigations, and it's been reported by the New York Times, of a proven excessive forces by state actors. And also, political scientists are saying that this is, a referendum on democracy. It's something that you brought up again with your quote there. I'm curious now, is where does Peru go from here? It doesn't look to me like President Dina Boluarte is going to call an election anytime soon. And should she call an election, there's no certainty, of course, that they will or can restore any stability.
No, well, absolutely not. But she would say, look, elections aren't formally due until 2026. She would say that it's not in her power to call elections, and she's right. It's not. It's Congress needs to vote to stage early elections, and Congress has voted on this matter. I actually lose track. It's so many times, and they voted on so many different sort of bills to move it forward to April next year or December this year, but every single time it's rejected, and it's rejected for different reasons. The right are basically, particularly as the protests have slightly sort of petered out, the right are just thinking, well, we can get through this. We can actually see this through to 2026 now. There's absolutely no need to do this. And then the left, Peru Libre in particular, they'd be happy enough with early elections, but they're only prepared to vote to support them if there's also a vote on establishing a constituent assembly at the same time to draft a new constitution.
And presumably get rid of the item about moral incapacity. Presumably so.
Wow.
It does seem like a very useful thing.
Well, I was going to say, I think everyone finds that potentially quite quite useful. But in the short run, though, I just don't. There's no appetite in Congress to impeach Dina Boluarte right now. That the left, the Peru Libre is pushing for her impeachment. In fact, right at this moment, there should be anytime now a vote on whether to stage an impeachment vote. So there are several stages to the process, but I'm not even sure they'll get enough votes for that. But even if they did, I absolutely don't see that Congress would vote to do it. And the reason it won't, of course, is because although she came to power along with Castillo, she's like nominally left-wing, she's now widely seen as being in league with the right. And the right sees her as a useful shield, because, of course, if she were impeached, who would be next in line? Well, the next in line in terms of the constitutional succession would be the president of Congress, Jose Williams, and he's a former commander of the armed forces. It's difficult to imagine that could take place without there being fresh protests, and I think Congress is very much aware of that. And also, it's Boluarte she's not trying to advance a sort of controversial left-wing agenda, which is really riling the right in Congress, that it would really want to oppose. So, as I say, I think it just sees her as a sort of useful shield, and it will just hope that things will just chug along and it can sort of see its way through to 2026. And I mean, I think the protesters absolutely assumed that they would have seen the back of Boluarte and Congress by now. And yeah, that's because, I mean, if we look at the obvious precedent is Manuel Merino. So Merino was the president of Congress. He took over as head of state after Martín Vizcarra was impeached in November 2020. And it was an abject disaster. And he resigned within 5 days. And this was after the police killed two pro-democracy demonstrators. Okay, yeah, and scores more were injured. But here's Boluarte clinging on to power after many, many, many more protesters had been killed by the security forces. So I think protesters would have assumed she would have gone, in their eyes, done the honourable thing and resigned. But if she didn't do it then it's difficult to imagine she would do now.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if they can chug on till 2026 under the conditions that you're saying, is this going to be, and I think this, as we sort of move this towards as we wind down our conversation a little bit, we need to move on to the economic cycle. And we can say quite firmly that under Castillo, investment and consumption dropped, and the credit outlook was cut to negative by Fitch ratings. And of course, there's this issue of the Peruvian paradox. Despite all of the political unsettled nature, violence, etc., tourism and the extractive industries never really were affected until, I would say, this time around. There was a wobble, and there was a wobble. Tourism, I mean, if we go even more superficially, if Machu Picchu was closed, could you even imagine the cash cow for tourism for Peru?
For about a month.
For about a month, which is a big deal. I mean, if you even prior to this, it's not happened. The extractive industry were, questioning their investments. So, I mean, what do we think? Are we going to go back into will Dina Boluarte and be her successful shield or etc. for I would say economic stability? Will the paradox continue, or are we looking at a new situation now in Peru?
Well, I think very much Peru is still a powder keg waiting to explode. I don't think it would take an enormous amount for these protests to flare up again.
Yeah.
And the idea that she could somehow last till 2026, I think is sort of almost inconceivable. But I mean, you were talking about the sort of impact on the economy, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, you know, investors have, it's not that they're not used to protests in Peru and elsewhere in Latin America. You know, they've become accustomed to them. This is sort of part and parcel of it. But this was big. I mean, this was bigger than anything they'd been accustomed to. I'd certainly, I would say this at any stage this century, really. But in terms of the sort of Peru paradox, I think, you know, people who live near mines often feel that they're not really benefiting from the wealth that they produce. And there's definitely a sensation that, you know, wealth, there's this vast wealth in Peru, and it's not been filtered down, but it certainly has been siphoned up. So, and again, this feeds back into, you know, and this is at the root of that sort of Peru paradox, and that this is why there's such widespread disillusionment with that sort of corrupt political class. But clearly investors don't like this kind of level of unrest. You know, it gives them the heebie-jeebies. I mean, but I think they'll feel that, you know, they'll hang in there till the dust settles. Peru will get a new president and fresh elections in the short term. They would hope, and who would be more investor friendly than Castillo, and, you know, the uncertainty and political crisis will sort of subside. But there's no question this was a big deal. And in fact, I read a stat just a couple of days ago. The central bank president came out and projected zero growth for the first quarter as a result, you know, of the protests. And mining, which is obviously the dominant sector of the economy in Peru, worth about 10% of GDP. Things have improved. The protests have receded. Obviously, massive disruption, but they have receded. But mining exports in January, so January is the peak of the protests, were down 20% year on year, around about 2.5 billion. And this is mainly due to a slump in export volumes, a little bit to do with price, but it was mainly export volumes. And so it can be directly attributable to the protests.
Yeah. I mean, this has to knock investor confidence. But like you say, they'll hang on in there while there's still a possibility of getting the product out.
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to finally, there's a couple of final points here. This, as you say, a powder keg, and I genuinely believe you for this one as well. It is a powder keg. A solution in itself is closing the social gaps. I mean, but that's such a huge topic. And as you say, people
monumental
in the mines,
undertaking.
Yeah, the people around the mines, who work in the mines, who live off the mines and so on, I have never really felt that they're receiving any of the trickle-down benefit of these things. How do you even start? And so I'm thinking about sort of like a region-wide issue at present, and of course we get the very visual images of people emigrating from their countries, obviously Venezuelans, Central Americans going up, those big caravans. But if we think of the Venezuelans and now Ecuadorians are increasing, going up to cross the Darien, so that slip of land between Colombia and Panama, so connecting South America with Central America, the most dangerous trek in the world, as people say, Haitians, Cubans. Yeah. Could Peru be another source in the region now if the economy continues to falter?
Well, I think the economy will bounce back. Already that, you know, the central bank president's sort of fairly calm that, you know, the worst is behind and the economy will bounce back. But that political crisis is, you know, that's not resolved, and fresh elections, for sure, in the short term, fresh elections would help enormously, and it would just diffuse some of the tensions. But it's not a panacea. You know, it's not going to suddenly fix everything, not least because in all likelihood, you know, another political outsider would get elected, and we could have this sort of perpetual cycle of political crisis in the future. But I think, you know, what is needed is, and what is essential, is political reform, because the political system's broken. But the real vexed issue is that, you know, the people who can fix it have a vested interest in it staying the same. You know, this is foxes guarding the hen house kind of stuff, and Boluarte has no popular mandate, and even if she were capable, and I've seen no indication really that she is, or that she's really contemplating any of this, she wouldn't have enough backing to push through a political reform either. And so I have limited hope really that deputies would advance with this, although I did see that the president of Congress, Jose Williams, was adamant that actually they could, and he even put a couple of suggestions forward that, you know, they could maybe have members of Congress could be sort of be re-elected at halfway through the mandate. It could be some discussion about kind of renewing Congress after 2.5 years, which is because of the 5-year term. But that's kind of things like that could help, but that's kind of tweaking, little tweaks really. And what's required is something really quite substantial, and I don't see the political will for that from Congress.
Well, and they don't want to lose their seats. They don't want to put themselves at risk when we suggest that it's for personal financial gain. I think that's an ideal place to end this conversation, Jon. It really has been quite, I mean, I think we could talk for hours, and I think we could go into so much more depth. I mean, you even started with the colonial period. Fortunately, we kept that sort of, you know, under wraps. But yes, there are underlying problems. Yes, underlying problems in the Peruvian situation that, neither of us believe, will be resolved in any moment soon. But at the same time, investors, tourists are not likely to be overwhelmingly affected, unless you say, as you say, the powder keg is you know, that spark. What could be the spark? And who knows? I mean, who knows really what Dina Boluarte might come out with soon enough. That's the unpredictability of Peruvian politics. So I think we'll bring this one to an end. I've been Richard McColl, talking here to Jon Farmer, who's the editor-in-chief of LatinNews. Obviously, a great knowledge on Peruvian politics and society, culture, and so on. I'd like to say thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge on this subject, and I hope out there the listeners have been equally as enthused with all of this background that we've been able to share.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's been great.
It has been a real pleasure to host this first episode of the LatinNews podcast. We'll be coming fortnightly with different topics on the region. So please subscribe to us. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll be back with Andrew Thompson, and we'll be discussing issues in Chile. And then after that, we've got Richard Lapper discussing Brazil, and beyond that we'll be talking about the Paraguayan elections as well. So of course, mark us down, bookmark us, subscribe, and continue to enjoy. Give us feedback. Take a look at the website latinnews.com. Thank you again for listening, and bye-bye.